Hello and welcome to Parliament House in Canberra on this final sitting day of Budget Week. Embracing big government, the Coalition unveiled a big spending budget on Tuesday, splashing billions on aged care, childcare, mental health, tax cuts for low and middle income earners and tax incentives for businesses. Well, tonight it's Labor's turn. Anthony Albanese will get a prime time opportunity to outline his alternative agenda for the country. We'll talk more about this with Shadow Finance Minister Katy Gallagher in a moment with our Thursday political panel. But the big news dominating the agenda this morning is the COVID-19 vaccine. Australia secured 25 million doses of the Moderna vaccine. This is a new generation mRNA jab, just like Pfizer. The contract is for 10 million doses to be delivered later this year and the remaining 15 million doses next year. We're told it won't change the current vaccine strategy, which is to give everyone under 50 the Pfizer jab and those over 50 the AstraZeneca vaccine. Instead, this deal with Moderna is designed as an insurance policy in case there are issues with supply, and also to bolster our future supplies of COVID-19 booster shots. That's because these mRNA vaccines are more easily adaptable to COVID variants.
Today is the next stage of future-proofing and of preparing for the future. The agreement with Moderna, which is focused primarily on our ability for 2022 to have a booster and variant strategy.
Moderna are probably the most advanced in developing booster vaccines. What we do know is that the TGA has agreed that they won't need to do clinical trials to prove that, so if the companies can show that the new vaccines produce antibodies in a simple small trial, that they will be prepared to register them.
During that press conference, Greg Hunt also revealed the government's taking the next step towards making these kind of mRNA vaccines in Australia. Right now, we can only produce the older generation jabs like AstraZeneca. If all goes to plan, it's hoped a manufacturer will be secured and the first mRNA vaccines could be produced here next year. While Labor's welcomed these developments, in the short term, Shadow Health Minister Mark Butler just wants the government to tell Australians when they'll actually be vaccinated.
The Treasurer, when he was releasing his budget on Tuesday, told all of the good people of the press gallery here in Canberra and the Australian community that the budget was squarely framed on an assumption that all Australians would be fully vaccinated, having received both doses of a COVID vaccine by the end of this year. The Prime Minister, the Health Minister and others have backed away from that commitment, which raises two important questions. What on earth is the government's vaccine rollout strategy if the Prime Minister and the Treasurer, of all people, can't agree on it? And secondly, how can people trust the paper on which that budget is written if the Prime Minister himself has backed away from such a central assumption that the Treasurer assured the Australian people of?
The government isn't setting a formal target and there has been some confusion about the assumptions in the budget. When asked today, Health Minister Greg Hunt said the aim was for everyone to have at least one shot by Christmas.
We want every Australian to be able to have that access to a vaccine shot during the course of the year. Those that would have access to mRNA in the last couple of weeks of the year, they would obviously have their second shot in the first couple of weeks of next year.
Well, as I mentioned, the Labor leader Anthony Albanese is putting the finishing touches on his budget in reply speech for this evening. We're expecting announcements on social housing, clean energy and more support for women. In keeping with that theme, Mr Albanese addressed the Women's Caucus this morning.
Tonight's an opportunity for me to outline our alternative Labor vision. A vision that will look after people, that has people at its core. Our starting point is one of respect. Our starting point is one that every human being is created equal. Our starting point is that by improving the economic and social standing of women, we help men as well. We all benefit from equal relationships. The way to grow the economy is by giving support to women's participation in the economy. And in last year's statement, and they still don't kind of get it with their response. In last year's budget reply, I was very proud that the centrepiece of that was our cheaper childcare plan.
And let's bring in our Thursday political panel, and I'm joined by the Shadow Finance Minister, Katy Gallagher, and the Nationals leader in the Senate, Bridget McKenzie. Welcome to you both.
Great to be with you.
Now, we're going to go back to the budget and reply in just a moment, but I wanted to start with this vaccine issue. Obviously, great news that we've got the Moderna vaccine as part of the portfolio now. But Bridget McKenzie, what do you understand the strategy to be? When will Australians be vaccinated?
Well, I think we need to be worried less about having a date and more interested that our government is working hard with our health professionals and our state governments to get Australians vaccinated as quickly as possible. We've done 5 deals now to get a variety of vaccines into the country. We're competing with people across the world to do that. And I think if you see the tragic rollout of this pandemic through other countries, we can be very, very thankful that our government shut the borders quickly, that we had an economic piece that underpinned our economy going forward, but also that we took very, very seriously the health impacts. And so, I think it's fantastic, this deal. I'm loving the fact that we're looking to manufacture that here at home. We've seen the fragility of supply chains exposed through COVID-19, and to have that sovereign manufacturing capacity of the types of vaccine that can be changed in response to variants within the virus is hugely positive, and I'm really excited about that aspect.
Do you acknowledge, though, that if there's one question Australians want answered right now, it's when they're going to be vaccinated?
Well, I think we've been really clear. We want you all vaccinated as soon as possible, and we're doing everything we can to make that happen. And if you compare us globally, there's some countries that the vaccines are getting rolled out quicker, and there's a lot of countries in the developed world where it's slower than our rate. So we're about middle of the pack. We're doing everything we can as fast as we can. And as you've seen over the last 12 months, this thing can change very, very quickly, and governments need to rely on scientific advice around how they manage the economy, how they manage the health rollout, and that's exactly what we're doing.
Right, and Katy Gallagher, obviously this Moderna deal today, we're going to have another 10 million doses arriving later this year. Do you think this will help speed it up so that people can actually get their first dose by Christmas?
Well, that'll be up to whether the government can roll it out on time and effectively. I think, Bridget said we're in the middle of the pack. I mean, remember the promise from the government that we were in front of the queue. So we are walking quite a way far back from that. We had 4 million by the end of March, 6 million vaccinated by May. We're nowhere near that. And I think the other thing with the Moderna vaccine is we've been calling for that for months, for an extra deal, and the government has been turning up to the committee I chair and saying it's not part of our vaccine strategy. We were advised to only have one mRNA vaccine, that's Pfizer, and in terms of manufacturing local, agree. Labor's been calling on that for months as well. So I think, look, the vaccine's been a schmozzle, and now we've got a lot of confusion about actually what is the timeline, and I can tell why. The government's running a mile away from having a timeline for obvious reasons, but I think it is important that the government at least is on the same page. The Treasurer said 2 shots by the end of the year. The Health Minister's saying 1 shot. What is it, basically? Because I think people do want to know.
And I guess the reason is that there's a lot riding on this vaccine rollout, isn't there?
Absolutely. I mean, the two things that are biggest risk to the economic recovery being as good as it can be are the vaccine rollout and the quarantine and situation. And frankly, in this budget, we've had an announcement today about Moderna, but in the budget on quarantine, it was virtually silent. Now, I just don't know how that is tenable for a Commonwealth government to sort of keep saying, oh, that's a state matter, that's a state matter, when it has such significant national economic consequences.
Given that the borders are likely to be closed for another year, Bridget McKenzie, well, that's what the budget says anyway. We know the Howard Springs is being expanded in capacity. The government's in talks with Victoria about their proposal. Is there a need for another large-scale quarantine facility if we're trying to get all of these Australians home?
Well, I think what we've seen through this whole pandemic, Jane, is a varied response from state and territory governments around the country. The heavy lifting of getting Australians home has been done by New South Wales, and that is an actual reality. We've seen the quarantine failures in a number of states, particularly my home state of Victoria, with tragic consequences. Being all said and done, this was a commitment that premiers all made, blue premiers and red premiers, that they would look after the quarantine, and that they were confident they could do that. We've had
Do you think they're
inquiries
expected
and
to last as long,
reviews.
though?
It's like years. I'm not sure
But
they
this,
signed
the
up.
pandemic is, well, they entered that knowing this was not actually going to be over by mid last year, right? That was a decision premiers of state governments made, knowing that this global pandemic would take a very long time to actually come to a conclusion. So I think we've made the commitment in Howard Springs. That's going to go forward in terms of getting borders open and managing life within a COVID pandemic. We've seen the border bubble with New Zealand be negotiated. I'm confident that there'll be a range of other such arrangements with countries, but at the end of the day it is about keeping Australians safe and managing our economic security through that.
And just before we move on to the budget in reply speech for this evening, Katy Gallagher, there has been some criticism of the government's approach to international borders from Labor's perspective. Shadow Treasurer yesterday, Jim Chalmers, said it'd be safe to reopen once the vaccine program was under control. Do you agree that that's the kind of the benchmark?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I've been standing next to Jim for most of this week, so he also has been talking about quarantine. I think there's an acceptance that once you get a higher level of vaccine, immunity across the community, you're going to have less chance of breakouts of the virus. But also how we manage quarantine. The two things work together. And look, I've been told by some health experts that there'll be some form of quarantine for a longer time than I think most people think. Now, how that takes shape, who knows? But I just think, again, the role for the federal government is front and centre there. They control the international borders. They have to have a stake in the game because it has such widespread economic consequences if we fail or if we don't get things in place soon enough.
Okay, budget in reply.
Yep.
Anthony Albanese is putting the finishing touches on his speech. As I said, social housing we're expecting to be a big policy. Back in 2019, Labor took to the election a $6 billion policy to build about 250,000 homes in 10 years. Is that the kind of policy we should expect tonight?
Well, I think we have to tune in at 7:30. I know Bridget will be.
I will glued to
You
the
will
set.
be to hear what Anthony has to say. I think it is career limiting to go on, a few hours early and start talking about it.
Is that the kind of scale we should expect, though? That's a big policy.
Look, I think social housing is fundamental to Anthony's story. Like, he is the child of a single parent growing up in a public housing commission house, and here he is tonight offering himself as the alternative Prime Minister. I mean, it says great things about our country, but it also says the importance of putting a roof over a little boy's head when it was needed by his family. So I think you'll see right through to the election that, housing is going to be central to Labor's story.
Well, housing affordability wasn't a big issue. There were some commitments in the coalition's budget, but just more broadly.
I think, so Jane, on that, I think one of the great announcements out of our budget is to not necessarily put all the eggs in the social housing basket for single parent families.
It was
actually ensuring that single-parent families, who the majority of whom are women, will now be given a leg up to actually purchase their home. It doesn't have to be their first home, following the economic trauma that often follows separation, particularly when you have young children, and needing to give them a security of home to grow up with. And that, I think, is an incredibly empowering measure within our own budget, because, yes, they get the security of a home, but also facilitating home ownership and wealth creation
it'd
as
be
a
interesting
result.
to see how that kind of policy does actually end up working out. But just on the budget, this is a massive philosophical U-turn. You've now gone big spending, big government, debts and deficits as far as the eye can see. How do you kind of reconcile that with the last sort of 10 years of economic, arguments from the coalition?
Well, I think, Jane, it's a really good question. You've heard the Treasurer quote John Howard a lot this week around, in the middle of a crisis, there's not a lot of space for ideology. And that's true. So if you look at post-Great Depression, post-World War II, and the recovery structural changes we saw as an economy there, having to turn away from Britain, one market, face Asia, develop a manufacturing capability at home, all the things that we are now looking to do as well, post-COVID, are things that have to be done in times of crisis. I mean, I remember, but I
wasn't applied.
Katy,
wasn't
you're the
applied
same age as
GFC, though.
You are the same age as I am, and we were coming of age in a period where our parents were facing 18% interest rates. There's a lot of tears shed, a lot of our friends and our own parents, it went bust, etc., because that was the recession we had to have in the global financial crisis in the late 80s. This particular economic situation we find ourselves in is 30 times worse than the GFC, where we had Wayne Swan's heroic assumptions built into his budget.
We have to go because question time is rapidly approaching.
Yeah, living on the balance.
Is the Treasurer
You just
quoting
chewed
John
up
Howard?
time.
Is the Treasurer quoting John Howard because there is some
all about
discomfort
timing.
within the coalition about the level of spending here? Is that why he's using John Howard? Just very quickly before we have to go.
I think what we're doing,
Yes.
what we're doing with this budget is securing our economic future through a global pandemic. These are unprecedented times, and they've required an unprecedented response.
Okay, Bridget McKenzie, Katy Gallagher, I'm sorry, but question time.
Next time I'm just going to talk non-stop.
Just butt in there. It's a great. We're all in the studio again together.